Okay, we're back at it here. We now move to the tumultuous 60s. Remember that, like we just did with the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s, we started with some contextual material on American society and culture in the 1950s, and we're going to do so here as well before moving on to the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. And we're not going to cover all aspects of society and culture in the 1960s. In fact, we're not going to touch on a lot of it, but some of the more salient features we will. I ask, as you can see on the screen, was an era of cultural deregulation, as one current scholar calls it, a good thing? And as an example, just one example of many we could use, the sexual revolution. The cultural deregulation being referred to here is a fancy way to say that American culture started to deviate considerably in the 1960s, and some of the value system of the 60s itself intentionally pushed this kind of deregulation. Not that culture had been regulated in a literal sense of the word by the government, but this is to say that traditional norms, ways of doing things were now increasingly seen as not only outdated but repressive and too stuffy and old-fashioned just for being old-fashioned's sake, and that anything that moved away from traditional American society was automatically a good thing. And so the sexual revolution is just one example. It's been taken for granted since then, not by all Americans, by many, that having a more open sort of set of viewpoints about sex has been a liberating thing for both men and women. That casual sex and sex before marriage and etc. Has all been in the direction of freedom and healthy. And in some ways that's true, and I mean it may be true, but there's another side of this as well, because certainly we can see, without me going into graphic detail, which I won't, I wouldn't anyway, that there is a downside to the sexual revolution, and that in some ways sort of the old-fashioned norms about courtship that are seen as absurd today actually helped to, for instance, cause young men to behave better and to, not expect to have, sex, right away in a relationship. That the old-fashioned norms and traditions about here's how you're supposed to meet someone, here's how you're supposed to talk to them, here's how you're supposed to arrange to get together with them socially, and there's a sort of series of steps, much of which was designed to eventually lead to, if things worked out, to a marriage proposal and marriage, family, etc. Those kind of traditions are now met with scorn, partly because it's seen as assuming that society is supposed to be heteronormative. And again, I'm not taking a position on one side or the other here. What I am saying is I do think there's the question mark there is worth paying attention to, and it's worth a sort of a vigorous debate on both sides. Rock and roll, and what can tell us about the 1960s? This is where we get to what I sometimes assign as a secondary book, James Patterson's Eve of Destruction, which we'll get to in a second. So when did the 1960s become the 60s? Which sounds like a ridiculous question, unless of course you've read the book, or that book. But what's being asked here is the 1960s, as we sort of define it or remember it in popular memory, or learned it through popular consciousness, television and movies, etc. When did it actually sort of become that? Was it 1960? Or did it ever really become that? The book, Eve of Destruction, How 1965 Transformed America, is one prominent historian's answer to this, and he says 1965. Now, I don't know Professor Patterson, but he is quite distinguished in the field, and I'm almost sure that he's not saying that it literally is 1965, but he's saying it's right around that point that you do see some rather striking shifts in American culture that are probably not accidental, when put up against what was happening in America at that same time. Because you can argue that 65, or right in the middle of the decade, is when the civil rights movement sort of got turned up another notch. Not that it hadn't already been heated before, and that the Vietnam War started to become, well, I mean, this did get turned up a notch because American ground troops were introduced for the first time right around that time. And what Patterson says, and what he does, is use different types of evidence to sort of show that something did change in the value system, in the way Americans sort of looked at the world right around 1965. And one of the pieces of evidence he uses is popular or rock and roll music. Eve of Destruction, as the title to his book, comes from this one-hit wonder of a song by a guy named Barry McGuire from the period from that year, Eve of Destruction. It's actually an interesting song. If you haven't heard it before, you can YouTube it. And the lyrics are the stuff of rock and roll music as we know it today, but not before that. So Patterson says in this book, historians and music critics have suggested that powerful forces unsettling Americans at the time, notably racial tensions and popular fears associated with the Vietnam War, helped to explain the increasing popularity of loud and often harsh music, such as that of the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan. So he goes into some interesting detail about this. If you look at the top 40, on the radio for 1964, there's a lot of Beatles songs, and the lyrics to not just the Beatles but other songs that were sort of the top songs, most popular songs in the country, were rather syrupy, sappy, lyrics about sort of love. And the Beatles' "I Want to Hold Your Hand," for instance, is a 1964 song. And what Patterson says is it's not until 1965 that you start to see songs like Eve of Destruction come out, where the lyrics and even the sound is harsher. And it deals with more than just, sort of a "I want to hold your hand" kind of trivia. It deals, popular music starts to deal with more serious issues. It becomes, somewhat more depressive, somewhat deeper psychologically, socially, etc., hitting on personal psychological themes and social issues of great moment. And he says it can't be an accident because, or it's not likely to be an accident, because right around that time you start to see things getting much more serious and in some ways much more frightening in American society. So it's just one of the types of evidence that Patterson uses to make the point. But he does. It's very interesting to read and at least somewhat persuasive. The counterculture of the 1960s, right? This is where we get to the hippies. The hippies were not the counterculture entirely. There are a number of elements to it, but they were certainly the most prominent element and the one that we remember the most today. But we have to keep in mind, even though I have a slide on this, and so I'm, I guess, guilty of it as well, that though the counterculture in the 60s was a part of this decade, and a significant one, it's also true that they were opposed to mainstream American society but that there were plenty of Americans who were defending mainstream American society. So the counterculture, right? You see sort of a march and protest here, but that would indicate that they have opponents. And it wasn't just the government. There were plenty of middle class, even working class Americans who were not interested in sort of supporting a counterculture. They were okay with the culture at the time. So again, I'm not taking sides, but we do have to remember that there were two sides to this, or more. I went to a costume party one time, not a Halloween party. A cousin of mine had a theme party, and the theme was the 1960s. That was it. And I showed up, as almost everyone else did, with a hippie costume on, a tie-dyed shirt, and peace sign around my neck, necklace, all this sort of funky stuff, and everyone else did too. And some ways into the party, doorbell rings, a couple shows up, my cousin's friends. I'd never met them, and they're about our age, husband and wife, and they come in, and she's wearing this kind of like long hoop, dress, and he's wearing a suit with a skinny tie and a crew cut haircut, and everyone's like, "You idiots! This was the 1960s, not the 1950s, as a party." And the guy said, "Oh yeah," and he had a book under his arm, and he starts handing the book around, and it's a yearbook from 1968. Which kind of, in some ways, sort of the height of the stereotypical counterculture image of the 1960s. And it was like from a high school in, I don't know, L.A. Somewhere. And I thumbed through it, and so did everybody else. And I was already teaching. I was pretty young, but I was already teaching college history at the time. And I was shocked. There was nothing in that yearbook, nothing, that suggested that there was a counterculture, that there were hippies, people with long hair, nothing. All the guys, freshman to senior, had crew cut haircuts, all of them. Now, keep in mind these were minors; they were under 18. But you'd still expect, I would have expected myself, and did, that there'd be something in there that would indicate the 60s that we all tend to think of as the 60s. I mean, almost everyone at that party, except for those two, came dressed as some, form of hippie or another. So that's always stuck with me. It's a point I should have made. I should have been the one to show up at the party that way to make an historical point. So we do have to be sometimes careful about how popular culture and our popular memory ends up kind of stereotyping a time period, and we tend to then sort of think of nothing else but that. That being said, here I'm looking at the counterculture and not the mainstream culture. But we're going to sort of bounce this off mainstream culture, of course, because that's what the counterculture was fighting against. The counterculture, according to H.W. Brands, embraced a lifestyle as far at odds with prevailing middle-class culture as they could make it. They wore cast-off clothes, grew their hair long, consumed drugs of all kinds, practiced free love, which meant sort of no sort of or few rules to sex, certainly loosened mores, values about sex. That's what I was alluding to in the first slide here in this section or segment, when it came to looking at the sexual revolution as an example of cultural deregulation. This kind of free love, has this been a good thing for American society? Our attitudes and sort of more open attitudes to sex, it's open to question one way or the other. They listen to poets recite provocative verse and non-verse. In some ways, the counterculture, particularly the hippies, were the successors to the Beat generation we saw in the 1950s, who were also greatly disillusioned with and disaffected from mainstream American capitalist society and culture. But were they right? It depends on who you ask. Some of the most famous events happened in the counterculture movement happened in the Bay Area, in San Francisco. Haight-Ashbury is a neighborhood, or the Haight District, sort of where the hippie and the counterculture movement sort of centered in San Francisco. It still has that feel to it even today. It's fun to visit that part of San Francisco if you've never done it before. Haight-Ashbury is the key corner, but still lots of shops and coffee houses and restaurants and stores that kind of still have the 60s counterculture and hippie feel to them. Also, and there's an overlap between the counterculture, of course, and the protest movements of the 1960s. But we should keep in mind that the hippies, in some ways, were not particularly political. Again, there's an overlap. So some hippies, long hair, that are sort of espousing the new value system of getting rid of anything traditional, doing things their own way, rebelling against mainstream American culture, were also involved in one protest movement, political movement after another. But keep in mind that what the hippies are actually most known for is being so disillusioned with American society that they dropped out of it. Timothy Leary, famous leader, I guess if you can call him that, of the 1960s, his famous phrase was, "Tune in, turn on, drop out," encouraging Americans to drop out of American society, which they thought was basically useless and worthless. So they went and sort of started to live in their own little rural communes, and I mean that's stereotyped sometimes too, but it did happen. So what I'm saying is that at least some of the hippies, part of their movement was not about protesting things in politics, whether it be protesting in favor of civil rights, protesting for women's liberation, on and on and on. It was sort of dropping out of American society, because political protesters wouldn't be protesting if they didn't believe there was a chance of fixing something and political change. What the hippies are in some ways saying is, forget political change, we're just going to drop out of this worthless society. So both of them are reacting to and against and sort of rejecting traditional mainstream society, but in different ways. The hippies are doing it in a much less political way. They're making a statement by being, divorced from politics. Now, again, with those differences, there's significant overlap here, Venn diagram kind of way. As one historian puts it, we see the 1960s as kind of a key turning point in America from an authority-based society, pre-1960s, to a rights-based societies during and ever since the 1960s. So that before the 1960s, authority still held sway. Young people especially tended not to buck authority, and from the 60s on, people have focused more, young people and others, on their rights. I was like, well, does authority respect our rights? No. If not, then we're going to protest authority. It was more or less unheard of before the 1960s, to at least in an overall way, sort of challenge the authority-based society. So just to give us an example, the 1960s, the protest movements, the counterculture included protests, and I don't have a slide on this, but I could, on college campuses about college curriculum, about the way colleges were run, and students protesting and that. There were sit-ins where the members of the student body was one of their tactics, would just lie down in the administration building on the hallways. So just cover the floors. And so any administrators, the college president or deans, this or that, to get into their office, they'd have to walk over a top of a sea of human beings laying there. And it usually, of course, then shut down the administration building for however long that they were there. That would have been kind of unthinkable for college students before the 1960s. Unthinkable. So there was much more of a respect for authority, for good or bad, and after the 1960s, there's less respect for authority and more concern with no. If authority is trampling on my rights or our rights, then we're going to we're going to oppose it, for good or bad. I'm just going to look at a few of the many mass movements and protest movements of the 1960s. We're not exhausting all, but just to give us a sense of this. One such movement was the beginnings and rise of the gay rights movement, usually seen to have started with the Stonewall riots in Greenwich Village in New York City in 1969. And as one historian said, suddenly, gay men and women were not submissive anymore. This incident at Stonewall was it was a gay bar in Greenwich Village. The police raided, and the people at and around in the bar fought back, and there was 5 days of rioting by hundreds of people, and some violence and tumult, as you see in the photograph in the middle there. The community, the gay community, was so energized by these events that important organizations formed the Gay Liberation Front, National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, etc., etc. Now today we'd say LGBT or LGBTQ, but gay rights movement was the phrase used at that time. The feminist movement here as well. Now we know that the women's movement had been around before, the women's suffrage movement we talked about, but there had been a women's movement around for a long time. From this point forward, it usually gets kind of called the feminist movement, especially into the 1970s. So the energy that sort of rose up here does continue into the following decade. Professor Rourke says women's liberation began to gain public attention. Women began to speak publicly about personal experiences that had always been shrouded in secrecy, such as rape and abortion. So, among other things, the movement now, women's rights movement, feminist movement, was now different in that new issues that hadn't been dealt with at all are now starting to be brought forward and publicly aired out. Like other movements, Rourke goes on to say, the rise of feminism owed much to the black freedom struggle or civil rights movement. For example, women used Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to gain protection from discrimination in the workplace. So women sort of picked up on some elements of the Civil Rights Act and said, we're going to use those to push for our own rights, which was a shrewd move. All of this led to a perceived need for, as one saying put it, an NAACP for women, and we see the formation of the National Organization for Women, or NOW, in 1966. A whole slate of new women's leaders sort of arise from this time forward, one of them being controversial Gloria Steinem, the publisher of Miss, the new magazine for women, and there were many others as well. Remember, Betty Friedan was sort of one of the founders of this sort of new wave of women's activism and feminism. And finally, just as our 3 examples here, the farm workers movement, particularly California and the United Farm Workers Union. Its charismatic leader, Cesar Chavez, who you see conferring with Robert Kennedy here, the president's brother and attorney general. Patterson says that Chavez had a charisma that gave him legendary status as a leader. He certainly had legendary status and probably was charismatic. In a fairly recent book on the 1960s, the politics of the 60s, the authors say Chavez, whose leadership of migrant farm workers in strikes, marches, and boycotts of grape and lettuce growers emulated the nonviolent campaigns of Martin Luther King Jr. This is true of the civil rights movement as a whole. It became kind of the model for all of the mass protest movements, mass movements for rights, for the people that have been oppressed or deprived of rights, discriminated against groups. Why was the civil rights movement the model? Well, partly because it came first. It started in the 1950s. These all come later on. So they look back on the civil rights movement, which is still going on too, but for examples to follow, for again models to follow. So the Delano grape strike of 1965, right in the middle of this decade, maybe the most famous single event of the period for farm workers. The UFW organized this massive strike, grape strike throughout the San Joaquin Valley. At its height, they had 17 million people boycotting buying grapes. And by 1970, the grape growers agreed to union contracts for the first time ever. That's not to say, of course, that there still aren't many issues with regard to the lives, treatment of farm workers by, California growers of grapes and other crops. But certainly, this is an example of at least a partial success story, and in part because of the gifted leadership of Cesar Chavez, but not just that, of course. So now we get to the two administrations that come about during this era. First, the Kennedy administration, and then the Johnson administration. Both of these together, referred to in a recent book as the liberal hour. And it wasn't literally an hour that they were president, but the phrase, as the title of a book, the liberal hour, of course, connotes that liberal values prevailed for a time in American politics, but for a fairly short one. Right? The reference to hour is a way to kind of exaggerate and say, well, it didn't last too long. And indeed it didn't. So, but these two presidents were influential on the liberal side, Democratic side of politics, in multiple ways. Though their legacy, their ratings as presidents are open to question. By this time, we should be familiar with things being open to question here. So Kennedy's package of legislation became known as the new frontier. John F. Kennedy was extremely ambitious. I mean, as a man, but also in his sort of view of what the presidency can and should accomplish, and what the country can and should accomplish. He said, it's time for a new generation of leadership. We need men who are not bound by traditions of the past, and that there's no limits to man's ability to remake the world. No limits to man's ability to remake the world. It's a nice sounding phrase, and it does sound pleasantly optimistic. But there are some things that can be said in criticism of that statement, and have. So are all traditions bad things? Some of them, to me, it's a case-by-case thing. There are traditions, in my view, that need to go at one point or another. We need to move beyond them. We need to get rid of that tradition. It's not helpful. Maybe it's harmful. Maybe it's unjust. But are all traditions worthy of being taken away? What if it's a tradition that we love? What if it's a tradition that has been part of your family forever? Now, if it is against the law or violates someone else's human rights or civil rights, then of course those are the kind that need to be eliminated. But Kennedy seems to be making a blanket statement about tradition being a bad thing. And then, on the other side, saying there's no limit to human beings' ability to remake the world. I think it can be argued that these kind of grand statements, which are common among presidents in the 20th century into the 21st century, have become a problem because it's sort of one president after another over-promising. If you say that there's no limit to the ability for humans to remake the world as president, and you fall short of that, as you obviously will, then there's disappointment and disillusionment with the government, or more specifically the presidency. So I do think this is it's a nice sounding statement in some ways, but I think it's open to question in others. Stephen Knott, my preferred expert on the presidency, quoted before on other presidents, says that Kennedy was the anti-Eisenhower in many respects, and was the epitome of the visionary president promoted by Woodrow Wilson and other avatars of 20th century progressivism. Kennedy's conception of presidential power was as sweeping and assertive as Wilson's. JFK believed that the American president was the nation's visionary-in-chief. His beau ideal of a president was one who embraced the ideal. Upon him alone converge all the needs and aspirations of all parts of the country, all departments of government, all nations of the world. Kennedy's charisma allowed him to form the type of bond the Wilson and other progressive thinkers, Wilson administration and other progressive thinkers considered the critical element of effective popular leadership. Presiding over a nation as an effective administrator, doing the unglamorous work of governing, does not make for a progressive hero. It was JFK's star quality, his charisma, conveyed through modern technology, television, that permanently embedded Kennedy's personalized presidency in the American psyche. So this quote is saying this guy's sort of the anti-Eisenhower, who took a low-key approach to the presidency, didn't believe that presidents should go out and try to make themselves rock stars. And in fact, Kennedy is seen by this author, because I've read this whole book and others by him, he sees Kennedy as the guy who has sort of made presidents ever since feel like they need to try to be rock stars. And there are a number of them that have tried, not just fellow Democrats like Kennedy, but on both sides of the aisle. Norman Mailer, one of America's great writers of fiction, said about JFK, he carried himself with a cool grace, which seemed indifferent to applause. There was a good lithe wit to his responses, a dry Harvard wit, a keen sense of proportion in disposing of difficult questions. Invariably, he gave enough of an answer to be formally satisfactory without ever opening himself up to a new question which might go further than the first. There was an elusive detachment in everything he did. I like that quote because it's both a series of compliments and some shrewd criticisms at the same time. He was calm and cool under fire. There's no doubt about it. Kennedy was smart, sharp, funny, witty guy, sort of an elusive detachment, meaning he was likable, but you're kind of untouchable. You kind of walk on water, can't get too close to the guy because he's sort of seen as larger than life, or he presents himself as such. But he's saying he was so good, typical politician, at least a very good one, in that when he answered questions by reporters or others, he'd give just enough of an answer to make the any further questioning go away, instead of giving such an elusive answer, such an empty answer that the questions just keep coming and coming. So that he was a master at knowing how to answer a question without saying too much and without saying too little, which probably isn't easy to do at all. So John F. Kennedy's rise to power is now legendary, partially because he was tragically assassinated, but he came from the Kennedy family. That part isn't surprising since his last name is Kennedy, but it's the Kennedy family. In the center, or near the center of the picture, is the patriarch of the Kennedy clan, Joseph P. Kennedy. We've already met him. Kennedy was appointed by Franklin Roosevelt as the first head of the Securities and Exchange Commission during the Great Depression, one of the New Deal programs, and then appointed by the same president as ambassador to England later on. And Kennedy had been a hugely successful businessman, multi-millionaire, who had such ambition that when his political ambitions were thwarted after he was fired as ambassador to England, he then had political aspirations for his sons. First, the young man to his left, Joseph Kennedy Jr., who was tragically killed flying over the English Channel in a plane in the military in World War II. But it was him, he that Joe Sr. first tapped to say, this guy's going to be president. And when his eldest son was killed, he turned to his second eldest son to his right, even younger, John F. Kennedy, or Jack as the family called him. And so everything was now on Jack Kennedy to become president. And Joseph Kennedy would just run around saying, my son's going to be president. And he was a super rich and famous and powerful guy, so it didn't seem impossible. Plus the fact that his son was obviously good looking and talented and had a personality, charismatic. But nonetheless, people must have rolled their eyes. Oh, yeah, your son's going to become president. And of course he did. But the Kennedys threw lots of dollars, of course, behind their guy, their relative, their namesake. And he first got elected to Congress, the House, after World War II. John F. Kennedy did serve in the Pacific Theater of War, so he was a veteran of the war. And then he quickly moved up and got elected to the United States Senate. Spent about 8 years in the Senate during the Eisenhower administration. Didn't rack up a particularly impressive record. Was kind of absent a lot. He worked really hard during political campaigns, but he seemed to work less hard once he was sort of in the job, though he became somewhat known for his shrill Cold War rhetoric and criticized the Eisenhower administration for, in his view, and he wasn't the only one, being too lethargic or not having an aggressive anti-communist foreign policy. And so Kennedy kind of started to make a name for himself that way. And he threw his hat in the ring in 1960 with experience now in Congress, but not a ton of it, and still a pretty young guy, around 40. This is the first presidential campaign where there was ever a live televised debate, which you see a photograph of on the left. Richard Nixon, the Republican, who had been Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years, was the Republican nominee, and Kennedy did win the Democratic nomination. And these two squared off then in debate, the famous Kennedy-Nixon debate. It's often said that this debate helped Kennedy to win the White House because Kennedy was better on television. And that's certainly true, but we don't know how much it actually helped him win, but it could have. Nixon came across as sort of looking nervous and sweating and perspiring, just looked uncomfortable. And frankly, Kennedy never looked uncomfortable anywhere, at any time. It was one of the keys, I think, to his political success, along with the money. But Kennedy was just unflappable. So just one of those people that has an ability to be calm and cool and confident under all circumstances. Much like Franklin Roosevelt, who we've already dealt with earlier in this class. I've heard this rumor that may be true. I've heard it in more than one place, that those who listened to this debate on the radio thought Nixon had won, and those that watched it on TV, the majority thought Kennedy had won. Which might mean that the actual words of the debate, the actual argument, went to Nixon, but as television so often does, it tends to force us against our will, whether we realize it or not, to focus on sort of more trivial things, like appearances. Although appearances, of course, matter in some ways as well. So, for instance, if Kennedy showed himself in this debate to be more calm and cool under the pressure of the moment than Nixon, does that not say something about the qualities you'd want in a president? It would for me. I'm not saying it's the only element. It's only one. But I prefer someone who's calm and cool and collected in the heat of the moment when the big decisions have to be made that affect us all in the world, than someone who's doesn't handle it as smoothly. When President Kennedy was tragically assassinated, and the assassination is one of the worst days in American history, I don't do a slide or a segment on this just because it's been talked about a great deal. Many of you probably know something about it already anyway, and it's a downer. I don't usually avoid downers, but this one I kind of do. Kennedy, it's hard to get I think an accurate assessment of Kennedy, at least on your own, because there's so much legend and myth attached now, because he got assassinated, and because he was a young occupant in the White House, had a glamorous wife, two cute little kids, and so this seemed like an ideal presidency. And right after he was assassinated, the myth-making went into high gear when Jackie Kennedy, his wife, who you see in the picture, in an interview with an historian named Theodore White, said that the Kennedy administration had been, quote, these are her words, Camelot, right? A magic moment in American history when gallant men danced with beautiful women, when great deeds were done, when artists, writers, and poets met at the White House, and the barbarians beyond the walls were held back. There'll never be another Camelot again. And even during his presidency, there was sort of a romance. The American public tended to be fascinated by this young, sort of good-looking family, that occupied the White House. So before Kennedy was assassinated, and certainly afterwards, there's a big sort of layer of myth, and we already know from previous units that the more an era is sort of caked with myth and romanticization, the harder it is to sort of really see through that and get to the more nitty-gritty reality. Another part of the Kennedy myth is something having to do with his advisors. His appointed officials, including his brother as Attorney General, but Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, you see in one of the pictures in the right, McGeorge Bundy as well, Dean Rusk. They became known as the best and the brightest, and they tended to be younger than sort of average for presidential advisors and people holding cabinet positions, especially his brother. And they had a reputation for sort of being this group of like mostly Harvard whiz kids that were going to solve all the country's problems because they were just so damned bright. So Kennedy, according to James Patterson, surrounded himself with intellectuals who seemed to burst with ideas for the future. Remember, Kennedy wanted to move to the future and forget tradition. But it's also, as Patterson goes on to say, the brilliant team that led the country into Vietnam and then poured fuel on the fires. So best and brightest, well, maybe. But they have the Vietnam War to explain away, or historians that support them to this day certainly do. President Kennedy was no doubt a good speaker, whatever you want to say about his presidency and Kennedy's rating as president, so to speak. So his use of the bully pulpit is one of his, I think, greatest sort of claims to fame. Remember, Kennedy was calm and cool in public, so that helped his public speaking ability. But he was eloquent. He was smart. He was good on his feet. He had a good sense of humor. And so he used the bully pulpit, a phrase that comes from Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. The bully pulpit was a reference to the president's unique ability to kind of reach out to the country, eventually to the world. So the president can preach to the world really in a way that nobody else can. That's true, I think, even now. Who else in the world, maybe the Pope, has the world's ear? And so Kennedy put this to use, and he certainly understood the importance and value of public speaking, for a political leader, especially the president. I think now, today, we tend to underestimate the importance of, oratory. It is less important than it once was, but I still think it's one of the important skills and abilities that a president, can have and maybe needs to have. In his inaugural address, his first famous speech as president, because it was his first speech as president, but he says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." So he's trying to kind of unite Americans around kind of a collective, patriotic, set of values, which he wasn't the first person to do that, but that phrase, a sentence, is a famous one in presidential history. Kennedy's record on civil rights was relatively good. compared to other presidents, it was great. But there are some historians that think his civil rights actions didn't go nearly as far as his reputation would have it. Another problem with assessing the Kennedy presidency, of course, is that since he died young and was assassinated in office in probably the most shocking assassination in American history, with the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln, just after the Civil War, he tends to get, I think, kind of an extra or an easy free pass on certain things because it was such a tragic end to his life, career, and presidency. So was his civil rights record really that good? Well, again, it depends on, I think, your frame of reference and what you're comparing it and him to. But I think there's a case to be made that it was a positive record, not as much as his successors, we'll see. So Stephen Knott again says, Kennedy's greatest domestic achievement was his ringing endorsement of civil rights for African Americans. It does say endorsement, which probably means that his words, his ability to speak, his ability to use his speaking ability to reach out to the American public was a positive in this case in support of the civil rights movement. He reminded his fellow citizens in June of 1963 in his sort of big civil rights speech that the time had come to dispense with 100 years of Jim Crow, segregation, a reminder that was grounded in the noblest principles of the American political tradition. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue, he said. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. This country, this is a country because all of us and all the people who came here had an equal chance to develop their talents. And he went on to say African Americans are being deprived of that this crucial feature of American society and values, and they can't be deprived of it any longer. As far as Kennedy fighting the Cold War, and remember, as a congressman, he had been very much concerned with foreign policy and critical of the Eisenhower administration for what he considered to be a weak response to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. His administration also changed from Eisenhower's massive retaliation to flexible response, which I did mention in our unit on the early Cold War. But he thought that the United States must build up, as did his Defense Secretary Robert McNamara below. McNamara was maybe the most celebrated of all of the best and brightest. Former president of Ford Motor Company before he took this job, head of Ford. He had been a Harvard graduate, worked on planning bombing raids over Germany and Japan in the military during World War II, and known for being a brilliant guy, at least brilliant when it came to analysis, spreadsheets, and things like this. Whether or not that transfers over to guiding a war is open to question. We'll get to that. So the United States must build up more conventional forces so that it can respond more flexibly to different circumstances. Patterson goes on to say few of the fiscal concerns that had motivated Eisenhower were concerns for this administration. In fact, many in the administration believed it would stimulate the economy, sometimes referred to as military Keynesianism, so that if there was less of a reliance on nuclear weapons and more of a conventional buildup, again, of planes and tanks and ships, that would help to employ Americans in defense-related industries, which actually is generally taken to be true, and I think generally is. Kennedy himself said, we intend to have a wider choice than humiliation or all-out war. That's a reference to Eisenhower's massive retaliation strategy, saying we need more different, varying gradations of how to respond, how we can respond in any one foreign policy situation or military situation or another. With regard to foreign policy, again, early on, the president had a summit meeting with Nikita Khrushchev in 1961, first year in office in Vienna. And this didn't go well, even from Kennedy's own admission, by his own admission, and his brothers, who said Vienna was very revealing. This was the first time the president, meaning my brother, had ever really come across somebody with whom he couldn't exchange ideas in a meaningful way and feel there was some point to it. It was a shock to him. So his brother isn't criticizing John F. Kennedy's performance. He's basically saying, well, he is a little bit in an indirect way. He's saying my brother was somewhat naive in thinking that he could meet with the Soviet premier and have a meaningful exchange of ideas, when in fact the Soviet leaders were always so coy, and demanding that they weren't likely to sort of sit down and sort of meet you, with sort of a back and forth that could be productive. There were likely to be way more shields and barriers up, deflecting this and deflecting that, and trying to take advantage of their opponents, or sort of back them into a corner. And in a more critical vein, plenty of scholars have concluded just that, as John F. Kennedy kind of admitted. So Kennedy came away here critical of his own performance, and saying Khrushchev got the best of me. Khrushchev was older, more experienced, and clever, so not a surprise there. Khrushchev challenged Kennedy with a new Berlin ultimatum, as John Lewis Gaddis, one of the great historians on the Cold War, writes. And after Kennedy made it clear that he, like Eisenhower, was prepared to defend West Berlin, even at the risk of nuclear war, he became convinced that his only option was a wall. So it's partly as a result of this meeting that the Berlin Wall ends up going up later in Kennedy's presidency. Speaking of Berlin, Kennedy went there in 1963 with regard to the wall issue and the United States commitment to defending West Berlin, right? This island of capitalist democracy surrounded by a communist country, a Soviet satellite country in East Germany. Kennedy went there and once again used the bully pulpit in his understanding of the importance of the president's words, and using his ability to manipulate the English language, which we've already said was fulsome. But he said 2,000 years ago, speaking in West Berlin, 2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was civis Romanus sum, which basically said, I'm proud to be a Roman, or I am a Roman. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is Ich bin ein Berliner. And I appreciate my interpreter translating my German. Kennedy had a sense of humor, but he also had the smarts to realize that if he said something, even basic in German, this would help sort of endear the German West German, West Berlin public to him. So these are among his most famous lines in his sort of public speaking career. But it did have, I think, the desired effect, which was to bolster confidence in American leadership of NATO, and through that, America's ongoing commitment to defending Western Europe against possible Soviet aggression and expansion. Kennedy presided over a number of American programs formed for the purpose of helping the Third World, the poor countries of the world as they were called then, Third World, to develop. So this is about development, which still goes on today. The Alliance for Progress and the Peace Corps, as one book on this time period says, have acquired a timeless aura of idealism, sacrifice, and civic engagement, but a common historical imperative impelled their creation: the concern to revitalize American global leadership during a time of high tension with the Soviet Union in the Third World. So this is maybe a little complicated, so I'll unpack it for you here. Sergeant Shriver was the head of the Peace Corps. Shriver was a talented guy, but what really got him this job was that he was married to John F. Kennedy's sister. So he's an in-law. So they could think of Shriver as a Kennedy. But what this quote is saying is that though the Peace Corps, Alliance for Progress, I think and I would agree, they were genuinely put in place to help third world countries to develop. So there was a genuine concern about it. But underneath that, and without the following, they might not have occurred, was this ongoing perceived need that we talked about already to win over hearts and minds in the third world, to bring countries into the U.S., right, capitalist-led world order, and keep them from going over to the other side, the communist sort of world order. The communists had less of a world order, but they had, sort of some countries in their orbit, and not the Americans. So this was, in that sense, clever, because these organizations are helping other countries to develop their economies, to modernize, to raise their standard of living, increase sort of wealth production, and this is, also beneficial because if it does succeed in doing those things, it's more likely this and that country will come along willingly, under the wing of the United States leadership of the international capitalist world order. So Kennedy is assassinated in November of 1963, and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who you see here, takes over as president of the United States. He was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One on the way back from Dallas, where Kennedy was assassinated, with Jacqueline Kennedy, his President Kennedy's now widowed wife, and Kennedy's body in a coffin in the back of the plane. So a very bizarre, surreal situation, probably for everyone involved, and even to think about it and see pictures of it today is chilling. I wasn't alive, and all of you weren't alive either, but it is one of those days where everybody remembers where they were, if they were old enough to remember it after the fact, when they found out that Kennedy was assassinated. And I would say that this is one of the worst days in American history. It's way up on the list, possibly at the very top. So, I mean, I want to qualify that. We've had days where people were killed in mass, like 9/11, which are horrendous as well. So in terms, I'm not trying to say one president's life is more important than thousands of Americans' lives, but when a president gets assassinated, right, those kind of things just have a way of being sort of indelibly sort of impressed into everybody's memory in a completely horrific way ever after. Again, not that 9/11 didn't, and I would put 9/11 high on the list as well of the most awful days in American history, and maybe higher than the Kennedy assassination. But the Kennedy assassination is in that, it's in that league, sadly. Johnson actually wanted to, and claimed he wanted to, out Roosevelt, and his package of legislation that we'll get to, the Great Society, was in a sense an attempt to rival the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, and to complete, in his view, the unfinished business of the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt didn't get everything he wanted in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and Lyndon Johnson is trying to complete it. And not surprisingly, because this is a link, in the 1930s, Johnson was a progressive Democrat and a supporter of the New Deal. He administered a New Deal program in his home state of Texas. Remember, some of the New Deal programs were administered at the state level, even though they were reliant on federal funds. And Lyndon Johnson got elected to Congress during the Great Depression as well, and he got to talk to Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt saw him as a young up-and-coming guy. A little bit took him under his wing. So he'd been a New Dealer from early in his political career and remained one ever since. In the interim, between his first days in politics and his accidental presidency here, at least at first, he became a giant in the U.S. Senate. He eventually went from the House to the Senate and became the master of the Senate. It was actually a title of a book with those words. He became one of the most powerful figures in the U.S. Senate, maybe in its entire history, not just at the time, and was brilliant at getting things through the legislative process and system. He was great at sort of politicking, convincing his fellow Democrats in Congress and Republicans on the other side of the aisle to go along with this or that, making deals, finding ways to get them on board. And so he was a master legislator, and he used that to his advantage, great advantage as presidency. But what are we to make of Johnson's presidency? This is a really difficult one because there's so many sort of ups and downs both in his presidency. One biographer saying that it was a story of great achievement and painful failure, of lasting gains and unforgettable losses. Some people loved the man and some despised him. Some remember him for great works and others for a legacy of excessive governance at home and defeat abroad. So that sort of is a good way to kind of see the dichotomy here in this presidency. Lots of success and failure, depending on how you look at it. Robert Dallek, one of his biographers, says the altered standards for immigration in the United States, the existence of departments of transportation and housing and urban development, consumer safety rules, environmental protections, public radio and television, food stamps, Head Start for preschool children, and legal services are only a handful of the programs that have had an enduring impact on the nation. So Dallek, one of his famous biographers, listing not all but a number of pieces of legislation that he was responsible for, that he supported, he pushed through, that Dallek is saying have been enormously beneficial individually and collectively ever since. In a more critical vein, Stephen Knott says Johnson was positively euphoric about the curative powers of the federal government. Curative means the ability to cure, to bring about positive change. Remarkably, Johnson's hyperbole exceeded that of Kennedy's. As never before, this is one of his own statements, as never before, man has in his possession the capacities to end war and preserve peace, to eradicate poverty and share abundance, and permit all mankind to enjoy their promise of this life on earth. Unquote. While Johnson deserves this is back to Knott's own words, Johnson deserves the highest accolades for his civil rights legacy. His unbridled confidence in the federal government led to the debacle in Vietnam. And Knott goes on to say in his book other issues as well. So Knott gives him high marks, high ratings for his civil rights legislation, but not for anything else. So there's, again, a lot of room for dispute over Johnson's presidency legacy. He's one of my favorite presidents to talk about, whatever I conclude or you conclude about how effective a president he was, how good he was for American society or not. But he was a larger-than-life figure, literally and figuratively. He's about 6'4", a Texan, the Texas accent, and he was an intimidator. And he used his physical presence, as you can see here in a very famous photograph or series of photographs. The one on the right, which is repeated on the left as well, is sort of the most famous one. But this was known as the Johnson treatment, and he would lay it on. So, like leaning over that guy and smiling, I mean that's not an accident. In a sense, he's saying, I could harm you physically, He's not actually threatening it, but he's using his size among other tools to intimidate. Ben Bradley, who was the executive editor of the Washington Post, big name guy in his own right, said when you came out from a meeting with Johnson, a one-on-one meeting especially, it was like a Saint Bernard had licked you all over your face for an hour and pawed you all over. Johnson, Patterson talks about this in Eve of Destruction. His eyes, dark and piercing, bore in on people and added to his thoroughly commanding presence. When he applied the treatment, he towered over people. He moved in close. From his pockets poured clippings, memos, statistics. Mimicry, humor, and the genius of analogy made the treatment an almost hypnotic experience and rendered the target stunned and helpless. So Johnson would flatter you, he'd intimidate you, he'd threaten you, he'd try to make an offer you can't refuse, but one-on-one he was hard to resist. So in the Senate, since there's only 100 members of the Senate as opposed to 435 in the House, there's more of an opportunity to get what you want by meeting one-on-one with people and convincing this and that senator enough to build up a majority of votes to do things. So by the time he was president, he was so used to working this way from his years in dominating the Senate that this became his sort of way of getting support for this and that policy, this or that piece of legislation as part of his Great Society program. George Wallace of Alabama, another one of the leading politicians of the age. I forget what the issue was, but he had promised Johnson that he would do something, and he hadn't done it. He was dragging his feet. So Johnson called him on the phone. We have a recording of this even now, and he just asked him point blank, "You didn't do what you said." And Wallace is kind of hemming and hawing and trying to make excuses, and Johnson just cuts him off and said, "Don't shit me, George." Right? You can't fool me. Johnson was a very, very colorful president. That's putting it lightly. He used really, really spicy language all the time. He told dirty jokes. He went out of his way to make people uncomfortable, sometimes in an actual cruel way. But he was very eccentric, and maybe deliberately so. One time he was in the presidential limousine, must have been in the countryside, I think, and he said, "Pull over, I gotta pee." He probably said it exactly like that, or worse. And he gets out on the side of the road, and there's Secret Service guys that have to go with him. And a Secret Service guy said, "Mr. President, you're peeing on my leg." And he just looked down and said, "Well, I'm the president, that's my prerogative." And he might have been joking, but it was still pretty cruel nonetheless. But he really knew how to make people feel uncomfortable and sort of as a way to exert his power and authority and get what he wanted. He was an extremely insecure president as well. And so he could be vindictive and he could be petty because of his own insecurities. He had tons of talent and ability, but also an insecurity that certainly got in the way of that talent. He declared war on poverty early in his presidency, and just believed that the presidency itself was there to be used to do positive things for the country. So he was very much a believer in strong government and government's positive role in improving American society, which makes him then a progressive. Going back to the progressive era, that's what progressives believed. He actually, at one point, he asked in colorful fashion, as always, "What the hell is the presidency for? All right, if it's not to be used aggressively to sort of improve and make America better." And so this was how the war on poverty came about, at least from his own way of thinking about his office. He said in the State of the Union address in 1964, "This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. I urge this Congress and all Americans to join me in that effort. poverty is a national problem, requiring improved national organization and support. But this attack, to be effective, must also be organized at the state and local level. For the war against poverty will not be won here in Washington. It must be won in the field, in every private home, in every public office, from the courthouse to the White House. Very often, a lack of jobs and money is not the cause of poverty, but the symptom. Our aim is not only to relieve the symptoms of poverty, but to cure it, and above all, to prevent it. No single piece of legislation, however, is going to suffice. Johnson took a famous trip to Appalachia, the Appalachian Mountains, which were notoriously a notoriously poor part of the country, to sort of see for himself what life was like in some of the poorest places in America. But this speech does show the very decisive role that he thought government was supposed to and should play, the very large role that government was supposed to play. He's saying we're going to cure poverty. We're going to eliminate poverty. It's a noble goal, to be sure, but whether or not it's doable, and whether or not the federal government even should, be doing that, with its resources, with its, effort and energy, is debated to this day. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, sort of the big rollout of the war on poverty. So this bill, again, as a former master legislator in the Senate, this president was uniquely qualified to get bills, of his own making that he desired through Congress, and indeed he did. So he worked extremely hard and pushed his subordinates, and was the guy who made the strategy for getting these bills through Congress. All of the Great Society programs, as his legislation was packaged under this name. Right? Remember, we go back to Theodore Roosevelt. We start to see names given to whole programs of legislation. The Job Corps was created, VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, Neighborhood Youth Corps, Work Study College Grants, Adult Basic Education, a massive bill in 1964. And Johnson wanted to push this stuff through extremely fast, and did. So a lot of the stuff he did either before he was elected in his own right or just afterwards. Remember, he became president in November of 1963 when President Kennedy was assassinated, and there was an election year the next year. So in November of the following year, he ran for, he had to run for the first time as president, and he won against Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate. But he believed that this stuff should get done quickly. Remember, Franklin Roosevelt had pushed strong in his 100 days to get as much legislation through quickly as possible, and Johnson's basically doing the same thing. He believed that the presidency was like a marriage. There's a honeymoon period, and that you've got to get as much stuff through Congress as possible while the public still likes you, because the honeymoon period will wear off. He said it in more salty language than that on a number of occasions, which I can't repeat, but that is what he believed. That's partly why this stuff goes through so quickly. But here's an example of how difficult this is to evaluate. He pushed things through so quickly and on such a massive scale, it was inevitable that some of these programs didn't work that well, at least at first, or at least were sloppy and wasteful, because they hadn't been thought through as much as they could have been. If he'd been more of a plodding president who sort of took things gradually and one step at a time, he believed in getting this stuff through and figuring out, getting the bugs out of them later on. In 1965, one of the signature pieces of the Great Society, a program of legislation overall, trying to out Roosevelt. This is a great example of extending the New Deal, doing things the New Deal had wanted to but couldn't. This is true here. Medicare, providing senior citizens with universal medical care, financed mainly through Social Security. Medicaid, federal grants to states for medical care to the poor. So medical government provided medical funding for the elderly and for the poor. Julian Zelizer, book on all of this fairly recently, calls this a huge step forward in creating a social safety net. It would guarantee the most elderly citizens no longer had to fear they would be unable to pay for hospitals and doctors. So Medicare and Medicaid in 1965. This is still with us to this day, whether you approve or not, because it's become controversial, particularly in recent years. Nonetheless, this was a huge change and a huge bill. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the two civil rights bills, this one and the next that we'll see, were begun by President Kennedy, but he got assassinated before they were pushed through, and Johnson was dedicated to seeing them finalized. And it's, I think, quite fair to say that Johnson was even more committed to civil rights legislation than was Kennedy. But he also felt the need to help Kennedy's legacy out by pushing this through, and this shows that he was always thinking politically, sometimes for good, sometimes maybe too much of the time, but he thought, while the nation is still mourning Kennedy's death, it'll be easier to push these through because I can tell the public, which won't be a total lie, it'll be true to some degree, that we're doing this partially because it's the right thing to do, but partially in memory of President Kennedy, who had started this. So it's important that we do it. So he was using mourning for the deceased president to help get these bills through. The Civil Rights Act was extremely important. James Patterson saying, a significant piece of legislation, far and away the most important in the history of American race relations. It was enforced with vigor by the Johnson administration. Another element of his presidency, this is, I think, much to his credit, is that especially on the two civil rights bills, this one and the next, he didn't just get the bill passed and then forget about it. He pushed and followed through. This isn't always true of leaders, not always true of the president or Congress, as a body or two bodies. Sometimes politicians will pass major reforms and changes that sound great, but then drag their feet on actually doing anything about them. So they get the credit for passing it and then decide not to push it further. But that's not what he did. He enforced these things from the get-go and made sure that he paid attention to make sure it was getting done. The second bill that I've been alluding to is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the next year. So Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. Martin Luther King, you see on both slides, was involved in the process. Johnson was already conferring with civil rights leaders, especially Dr. King. The Voting Rights Act was in the process of happening at about the time that the famous Selma March happened, which you see on the left. There's been a recent movie made about this, but Martin Luther King and civil rights activists in Selma on a protest march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge to be met by law enforcement who harmed them and abused them and used force against them. That made made news all across the country, as it was intended to do. And both King and Johnson kind of used both of these things sort of back and forth as a way to get get more juice or political support behind the Voting Rights Act, meaning that Americans who might not otherwise have been all that concerned that the Voting Rights Act was passed might be more sympathetic once they see the news of African Americans being beaten when they're marching peacefully without weapons and not resisting arrest, etc. So the Selma campaign was in part, it says at the bottom, a deliberate effort by Dr. King to force the government's hand on a voting rights bill and give LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the opportunity he had been looking for. After the Civil Rights Act, Patterson says, if the Democratic Party hoped to maintain a decent foothold in the South, it had to ensure that African Americans would be allowed to register to vote. The point being that after the Civil Rights Bill of the previous year, if African Americans didn't get the right to vote, the South was never going to vote Democrat again. In fact, even after this passes, and it did help to get more and more African Americans on the voting rolls, even then, one could argue that this ended any hope thereafter of the southern states, at least southern whites, but the states as a whole then voting Democrat. And if you look at the political maps today, in election after election, the map of the South, right, where these events took place, is usually red. Before the 1960s, the South had been blue, had been Democratic almost all the time. Now, in presidential elections, campaigns for Congress, it does vary somewhat, but it's been largely red. Johnson himself had told, according to one of his aides, who is just retiring from journalism, Bill Moyers. This is Moyers' own claim, so we should take his word for it or not. But Moyers said that after the Voting Rights Bill of '65, Johnson told him privately that I fear that what we've done is lost the South for the Democrats for the foreseeable future. And if he said that, he predicted basically accurately, although we can't be sure that it was the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights legislation the year before that, or Civil Rights Act the year before, that caused that switch and change, but the timing certainly is suspicious. So the Voting Rights Act, you can sort of look at the provisions of it here, but once again, like the Civil Rights Bill the year before, the effects were immediate. Federal examiners were in their positions 4 days later in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, the worst states in terms of their record in adhering to the Constitution and allowing Americans the constitutional right to vote, which had already been there, of course, as you know, since the 15th Amendment during Reconstruction. It's amazing that it took another Voting Rights Act to start to change, things, in a positive direction for African Americans and for basic justice. In a few months, 250,000 new voters registered, and of course, more as time went on. Also, just the legislation we've already looked at, the Medicare, Medicaid, the war on poverty, and the two civil rights bills, that's enough, to conclude that this package, the Great Society, was, maybe not out Roosevelting Roosevelt, but maybe a close second. But we're not done. Next came the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965 also. Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, said LBJ was a nut on education. He felt that education was the greatest thing he could give to the people. He just believed in it, just like some people believe in miracle cures. Johnson had been a teacher in Texas when he was a young man, and taught primarily in a district or school where it was mostly Mexican American students from poor families, and probably partly where he got his great concern for everyone having as much access to education as possible. The woman sitting on his right shows Johnson's gift for politics, gift for staging and framing politics. Who is that person? Well, I don't know her name, but that's his former grade school teacher. I don't know, it was like second, third, fifth grade, whatever it was. But what a brilliant political stroke. She must have gotten a kick. I'm sure she remembered that she had taught Lyndon Johnson, now the President of the United States, and his administration reaches out to her, calls her to ask her to be there on the day that he signed the legislation into law. And he introduced her as such, and got a big kick out of it. They all did, but it was a great PR stroke at the same time. That's the main reason he asked her to be there. And we're still not done yet. The Immigration and Nationalization Act, or Hart-Celler Bill of 1965, opened the country back up to immigration once again. Remember, since 1924, the 20s, with the National Origins Act, since then, America's basically been closed down to immigration. That's about 40 years. And now it's the Johnson administration. I mean, this stuff goes through Congress. And I should note, actually, I'm glad I remembered, because it would be unfair not to, no, this wasn't, I just forgot. But this wouldn't have happened, this whole, tidal wave of legislation, or would have been way more difficult if, in fact, Congress had been less compliant. But Congress, both houses were in the hands of Democrats, fellow Democrats. So Johnson, though he was a master legislator and, guided these things, pushed them through Congress partly on his own skill and ability, it's also partly because he already had majorities of Democrats on his side in both houses. The long-term impact of this Immigration Act, as Julian Zelizer writes, shifted the balance of immigrants toward Asian, African, and Middle Eastern immigrants, but ended the stringent quota system that had been instituted in the 1920s. So the quotas for the 1920s, the bill signed into law by Calvin Coolidge, which had racist overtones, to be sure, now is finally lifted and replaced by this. So immigration in the country opens back up again, though of course that would in time become controversial, as it has been in recent years. I mean, it even was controversial somewhat then. The fabulous 89th Congress, the question mark. So was it so fabulous? The 89th Congress is that Congress that just pushed all those bills through, dominated by Democrats, supportive of President Johnson. They passed 89 of the 115 proposals that Johnson sent to it. Johnson's approval rating by the public just after this wave of legislation went through was 70%. But that's still the honeymoon period, and Johnson knew it was going to go down, and indeed it did, partially because of the Vietnam War. Zelizer, again, one of the historians I've been relying on here, said Johnson's insights and actions, his legislative experience, and his tactics had been crucial in getting the legislation passed. That's certainly true, though, again, as I said, we have to amend that a little bit by recognizing that he had majorities already on his side. A reporter of the time, at that time, said rarely has one man so dominated Washington as President Johnson now does. Johnson is like an orchestra leader, a traffic superintendent at a busy railroad front. So much of the praise, I think, is deserved, especially the ability that he had and the drive he had to get things through Congress, and doing so successfully. But on the downside, Amity Shlaes, who's a conservative scholar and often criticizing Republican leaders, Democratic leaders and presidents, doing so again here, says, we glorify LBJ's ability to see ideas into law with scant regard to the consequences of those laws. The overpromising in social programs disillusioned voters, black and white. She's, I think, primarily referring to the war on poverty programs and legislation here, saying that they promised the moon and fell short of that so much that it disillusioned voters, both black and white, and people of all different backgrounds in American society, which is arguable, but I think you can make a case for that. All right, thank you.